This view scene is called Mountain, which you can load in by going to File and Open and choosing the Mountain view scene. I've got a quick render I did, kind of lower anti-aliasing to show what the terrain looks like. It's procedural terrain, and there's a slight modification and cutout up on the top of the terrain using the 2D painting in order to kind of create a hole up at the top of the terrain, so it's kind of like a volcano. Now what I want to do is use this object as a collision object for a dynamic system, and the proxy object itself is not going to work well for this because none of the polygons are merged, which is going to just do some really bad things if I was to use it as a collision. So what we need to do is create a matching Lightwave object that we can use from the proxy. But we also want it to match without having to spend too much time modifying and placing it. The possibility to export this terrain, or it is a possibility to export this terrain, but then we're going to have to match scales and everything else in order to get it to match up, which probably would just take too long and may not be a perfect match. Now if we take a look in the wireframe mode, there's quite an inconsistency between the geometry because of the way it's calculated based on the camera's position. If you need a higher res object, it is possible to take the camera and just move it temporarily to the center of the terrain, and then you can edit the terrain, click OK, and it'll generate a higher res copy based on the camera's position, and in this case, a very high resolution copy. It is still going to be a little inconsistent because of where the camera was located, and what we're going to end up with is a really high res center, and then the outsides are not nearly as with as much quality. Now if this will work for you, and this would work quite well, the only problem is because of the variation around where the intersections are meeting between the different resolutions, those objects and polygons will not connect correctly, which means there's going to be gaps in the object. And for the most part, we just don't need this high quality of an object as a collision, really depending on the effect. If you were going to have it hit every single tiny bump on the way down, then you're going to need something a little more high res. But there is a better way to generate an object for this, and the only way to get a truly consistent mesh is to use a standard terrain. So what we can do, and this is very important, we're going to create a copy of this terrain in order to convert it to a standard terrain, but we do not make copies using Lightwave commands. Copy and paste commands, clone, it would be technically a clone command within layout. Not a good idea. All it will do is create a duplicate of the proxy. It will not create a duplicate of the terrain in view. So what you need to do is copy the terrain and paste it using the view commands. And that's really the only way to guarantee that it is going to correctly create the geometry. So now what we can do is go into the options and edit the object. And depending on the quality you need, you'll have to set the resolution up at the top. 256 by 256 is the default size for terrains. So it is generated with 256 polygons, basically pixels, by 256 all the way on the X and Y, and then extruded upward. Unless you have any sort of 3D sculpting, then the geometry changes quite a bit. So we need to take a look and figure out how many polygons we're going to need before we convert it to a standard terrain. So we can double the resolution, which is still going to work off of any modifications we made on the 2D layer, along with using the original geometry created from the procedural. And this is probably going to be more than enough geometry, if not too much. So if you do want to downsize it, you can also do that. So we can have the terrain resolution, and you can bring it all the way down to, I believe, 64 by 64 is the minimum, possibly 32 by 32. And once you have your resolution set, keeping in mind that you can reduce the resolution after converting it to a standard and still end up with an accurate copy. So start out with a high resolution, and if you need to, work your way down. So now from the menu up the top, we can go from procedural to standard, and now we have the standard terrain. And click OK. And it has generated the standard terrain in the scene. So I'm going to switch back over to the shaded solid mode. And we now have just the object called terrain. It won't have a procedural in front of it anymore because it's no longer procedural. It's just a standard height field terrain. And I'm going to go ahead and save this object with it selected. So we're going to be saving an object copy because we don't want to save the active object because we do still want to use this scene. If we were to save the proxy, it's going to overwrite the temporary proxy file and more than likely just crash the program. So I'm going to name this object mountainFX. We can also clear this object from the scene, so minus key on the keyboard and delete the standard terrain version. Now before I load in the object, I do want to go into Modeler and make modifications. Obviously we need to merge the points, but the surface is also going to be an issue. So I'm going to load that object in, and we're going to reassign the material. And you may notice that the overall shape and size of this is going to be a little bit different. So we'll have to see whether or not we need to match the scales. But first, actually, I'm going to go ahead and really quick just merge it. So M on the keyboard, merge all the points together, and now go to the surface editor. And as you can see, we have the xStream surface assigned. So we don't want that to be assigned because it might cause problems with the proxy. So we can hit Q on the keyboard to change the surface. And if nothing is selected, everything is selected. So since no polygons or points or anything like that are selected, we can assign a new surface. I'm just going to call this FX Mountain. Click OK. So now we have a new surface, and we can turn on smoothing. We're not going to be rendering it, so it really doesn't matter too much. I'm also going to go ahead and cut this from the first layer or the second layer and put it in the first layer. We can save it and send the object to layout. So as you can see, the scale is different, quite a bit different. So we need to be able to match the scales to the procedural object and the view object without interfering too much with the terrain. One problem with using proxies is sometimes when they update, they're removed from the scene and replaced in it, so any connections to them may no longer exist. But what I'm going to do is open up the motion options for the mountain effects. And under controllers and limits, we're going to set position, rotation, and scale to be that of the procedural terrain. Which in this case it looks like is quite a bit off. So in this case, I think we will unfortunately have to size this manually. There is the ability to save the actual proxy that we had instead of saving an object copy in order to maintain the scale and preserve the object within the scene. If you're going to do that and just select the proxy and save it and then open it in Modeler and modify it, you want to make sure that you're going to have your view scene saved first, and I would really suggest making another copy of it, a duplicate copy, in case it gets corrupted. And then after you save the object, update it in layout or in Modeler, merging the points and keeping it in the scene, closing the view scene and reopening it. And that should potentially fix things. Not necessarily going to, but there are always a few things to watch out for. So now we basically just need to scale this to match, keeping in mind the rotation. We might be able to assign the rotation to be the same. So we have 212.5. I'm just going to copy that and paste that over. So that does match up. It's mainly the scale. Even the position might match up, but if we're already going through this much to create a match, might be a little bit easier just to do everything manually to avoid any errors or losing any information. So it's just a matter of matching up scales. And if you need to go outside of it a little, that should be okay. So now we have an object that we can use as a collision. So we can go to the object properties, and under render, we're going to set the dissolve to 100, unseen by rays, unseen by camera or fog, unseen by radiosity, and turn off all the shadow options. And then we can go to dynamics and add collision. So now is a collision object that matches very closely to the procedural terrain. So we can use this within any effects in order to bounce and use the terrain to modify dynamics. So just to show you really quick how that's going to work, I'm going to go to the Dynamics tab and add in particle emitter, HV emitter, change the scale to, let's make it a little larger. I'm just going to close that out for the moment. Switch over to position, raise that up above the terrain, And let's just make them kind of fall down on top of the terrain. It's going to be a fairly easy setup, nice and quick. So we'll go to the object properties for the emitter, and I'm going to set a fixed start frame of let's do -15, just to give us a little bit of particles to start out with. Go to the particle tab and set the lifetime to 300, just to make sure we have enough time with our delayed start. If I wanted to change that, change the particle limit. I don't really have to worry about running out of resources for the particles, so I'm just going to create a very high amount. We're going to go over to the... first, I actually want to set up a group. So I'm going to call this the terrain group. And then we will need to update the collision as well for that group. But that way, in case we have any other effects or different winds, we can separate them. So now we need to have some sort of force, so I'm going to use gravity. I'm not going to use realistic gravity. I'll just start with -5 and see how that's going to work out. Actually, maybe we will. So -9.8 on the Y for gravity. And we're going to switch over to the mountain effects layer, grab the collision, and switch that to the terrain group. If we need to modify that geometry, once again, we can just use, maybe create a new object, replacing the one that's already lined up. So kind of a copy and paste solution. Or we can use the reduce polygon commands within Modeler. Going to the Reduce tab, there is a Reduce Polys Plus that works pretty well. The only problem is it does tend to separate a lot of the polygons if you run it too many times. But it does work pretty well for a reduction. With LWCAD, in combination, you can use the Fix Polygon tool, and that will remove any horrible effects that are created from the reduce poly. So now if we take a look, most of these objects or particles are just kind of staying towards the back, so we need to take a look at where the camera is located. Our main camera, so I'm going to grab that object, bring it more to the front. And we can see that working out pretty well. They are kind of bouncing around a bit, so we may need to go back and use a lower polygon object, but I'm going to change the start frame to -60 to give a little more sense of what's going to happen in the full animation. You see all those objects just kind of coming down. If that vibration is too much, it might be removed if we calculate. So go to the properties, and I'm going to calculate. And there was a very large difference between the calculated version and what was showing in the preview. Basically, the bounce and bind power needs to be reduced. And the preview we were seeing before it was calculated was not accurate at all. So at least it's not vibrating, but it is way too intense. So in this case, what we'd have to do is just reduce the bind power, going to the mountain effects object, go to the properties. And for, I guess, no apparent reason, View did just crash the scene. So I'm going to suggest closing the view scene while working on dynamics and reloading it when you need to merge everything together.